our program this morning. 4 questions we should be asking our presidential candidates. And it is a pleasure now for me to introduce our special guest star today. Dr. Michael Siegel is a senior education specialist at the Federal Judicial Center in Washington, D.C. He organizes and presents training programs for federal judges and court unit executives on leadership development, change management, and negotiation skills. He is an award-winning adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University and author of The President as Leader, 2nd edition. Michael, take it away.
Thank you, Gil. Thanks so much for everything you're doing for our community. Really appreciate it. So we have a presidential election coming up, and I'm sure you're all tuned in to that intensely. But I want to get us started by reading the conclusion of my book. I want to read you a comment of what the job is. And I'm quoting now from a poster that hangs in the Muhammad Ali Museum in Louisville, Kentucky. And it's from Muhammad Ali's coach, Angelo Dundee. And it goes like this: if you take the endurance of a tennis player, the courage of a racing driver, the sensibility of an actor, the continued discipline of a long-distance runner, and mix them together, you're on your way to knowing what it takes to be a professional boxer. If we would apply this formulation to the presidents, and I do, it would go something like this. Imagine if we had somebody who had the experience and networks of George H.W. Bush, the courage and strength of purpose of Ronald Reagan, the intellectual power and political insight of Bill Clinton, the moral integrity of Jimmy Carter, the clarity of vision and perseverance of George W. Bush, the intellectual strength, listening, mediation skills, and rhetorical elegance of Barack Obama, and yes, the mastery of media and populist appeal of Donald J. Trump. We would have a pretty good president if we had all those things, but we don't get to have that person. Instead, we get some combination thereof. I want to show you a list of the greatest American presidents as determined by 91 historians and presidential scholars. They used about 10 criteria, well, I won't go through the list, but some of them I want to actually draw out from you. What I want to ask you, and by the way, if you look at any list of great presidents, and there are many, the top 3 are always the top 3. It is so consistent that the top 3 are always the top 3. Unfortunately, right before this presentation, I read a very disturbing column in the Washington Post about George Washington as a slave owner. But he's still up there. He's still in the top 3. And what I want to ask you, and I'd appreciate if you just put your answers in the chat box, and hopefully Deb will be able to relay to me, what gets you on this list? What are the common characteristics of leadership that you see among these men and someday women?
Okay, Michael, I'm going to read you some of the comments as they come in.
Thank you, Gil.
So we've got rising to challenges. We have compassion. We have clarity of purpose, empathy.
Good.
Get us through existential crisis, or get US through existential crisis. Innovators, vision, caring for the lesser of us, courage of their convictions, integrity. Good list.
Great list. And it speaks a lot about what we look for in our leaders. And these are all very important things. I'm going to actually focus quite a bit on vision as one of my 4 questions to ask. Is the question, do you have a vision? and we're going to get to that in just a minute. But a couple of other things that I didn't hear Gil read on
Michael,
this
there's
list.
one more just came in. Empathy, equanimity, wisdom, able to think through complex situations. So that's
excellent list. So there are two additional ones I would add. One is communication, and being able to communicate to people in a way that's persuasive. And the second is actually persuasion. That all of these men were great communicators in their own way and in different ways. Lincoln was incredibly articulate, incredibly persuasive. And yet, if you put Lincoln on television, he would look awkward. He wore poorly fitting clothes and told really awkward jokes. And yet, when he spoke from his heart. And he spoke with a conviction that really convinced people. Lyndon Johnson once said, "Nothing convinces like conviction." And the same day that Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address, the orator of his day delivered an address 2 hours long. And after this 2-hour speech, Lincoln got up and delivered the Gettysburg Address. And the orator of his day wrote Lincoln a letter saying, "You hit the nail on the head in 3 minutes, as I could not do in 2 hours." So he was succinct and he spoke from his heart. And I want to also talk about persuasion, because persuasion is one of the undervalued skills of leaders, in my opinion. So I'm going to move on, unless there are any other questions or comments. And by the way, feel free to raise questions at any time during this talk. You don't have to wait for a designated time. Well, you know, when we look at the presidency, I want to talk a little bit about the context of the office, because we think of this office as the most powerful office in the world, and in many ways it is. And yet, as John Kennedy famously said, it's a great office operating under great constraints. And these constraints were deliberate, and they were put there by the founders. There are constitutional constraints, as we know, the checks and balances. Congress has a very real role to play in the operation of the government. The president can't get whatever he wants from Congress. Even when he controls both houses, he has to fight, as Obama did in his first 2 years, etc. We have the courts, the institution I work for. The federal judiciary has challenged Donald Trump 65 times so far. Again, on constitutional grounds, on violations or perceived violations of the Constitution. There are political constraints. Obama wanted to pass gun background checks. 96% of Americans agreed with him. And yet he couldn't get through Congress, primarily because of the NRA, the National Rifle Association. And finally, the media and interest groups all play constraining roles on the president, to the point where presidents who have served in the office have had a different view of it. Lyndon Johnson, who knew how to use power, said, "The only power I have is nuclear and I can't use it." But he could pronounce it, unlike some other presidents. Truman said about Eisenhower, "Poor Ike, he'll say, do this, do that, and no one will do a thing," thinking it was going to be like the military, and it isn't. And Truman knew this better than anyone, because on the same day that Truman was supporting the partition of Israel and Palestine, his own State Department was supporting a totally different policy, trusteeship. And Truman said afterwards, "I never felt so low in my life. I felt like I'd been shot in the back." He was really devastated by his own State Department. George W. Bush, Bush 43, went to Prague in 2006, and he said, "I want in every unfree country, I want ambassadors to meet with dissidents. I command this." In 2007, the State Department looked at their activities, and it hadn't happened. And there's a very interesting conversation that I recount in my book between a State Department official and a Bush staffer, a White House staffer. And it goes something like this. Bush staffer, we noticed you didn't do what the president asked. State Department official, that's right, we didn't. Bush staffer, why not? State Department official, we never got around to it. We didn't budget for it. Bush staffer, but it's policy. State Department official, what do you mean it's policy? Bush staffer, it's in the president's speech, read it. State Department official, very important. Policy is not what's in the president's speech. Policy is what emerges from interagency meetings. Very, very interesting about the ability even of a president to issue a command. What does that say about you and me and our ability to do that? It's very constrained. Richard Neustadt, who worked for many presidents, said the power the president really has is the power to persuade. And one of my favorite quotes about leadership comes from a former chief judge of the Sixth Circuit, Gilbert Merritt. When they handed me the reins of power, nobody told me there was nothing attached. A lot of leaders feel this way. They inherit this great position, this great office, and they can't get anything done. Why? Because the office can't accomplish anything. It's the person in the office, and it's their purpose. And if that's not clear and passionate, then nothing's going to get done. 4 years will go by, and not a significant thing will have happened. So how do you then get hold of this and convert the reins of power into actual accomplishment? I think you do it in 4 ways. And these are my 4 basic criteria of leadership and the 4 questions I have for presidential candidates. And by the way, you have a list. If you go to the synagogue website, there will be a list of the specific questions on the website, the detailed questions. So I'm going to summarize them for you. The first thing I ask a president is, do you have a purpose? Do you have a vision? What does that mean to you in the chat box? What does having a vision mean?
Right, a vision is often literally what will it look like? What will it feel like? What will all of those things be like? But now we're getting other people, so that's even better. So we're getting goal of purpose, having concrete goals
Yep.
and objectives, a clear goal that can be shared.
Yep.
Vision equals a goal to achieve or purpose to be served.
Good.
Is unwavering core values.
Good.
Must be short-term and long-term. A direction that includes the people and the ethos.
Excellent. Yeah, all great. Where do you want to take the country? We had a repeat of Teddy Kennedy last week with Donald Trump. In 1979, Teddy Kennedy, who was running against Jimmy Carter because he and many other Democrats were unhappy with Carter's first term, he went on the Roger Mudd show. This was a draft Kennedy movement that he finally responded to. And Roger Mudd asked Senator Kennedy the following question: Senator, why do you want to be president? Now you would think, what a softball. Oh my God, here's why I want to be president. Here are the 10 things I want to achieve. Here are the goals that you just talked about. Kennedy couldn't answer the question. He started talking about the resources of America. He started talking about all very unrelated things, and it really looked bad. It wasn't the only reason that he didn't successfully challenge Jimmy Carter, but it added to it. Last week, in the most friendly environment imaginable, Donald Trump was asked the question, what's your agenda for the second term? What's your vision? He couldn't answer the question. His answer was something about experience is a great word. Experience is a meaningful word. And then he went on, again, totally unrelated. And by the way, I'm not comparing these two men at all, but in this sense, they both failed in the moment. Ironically, Teddy Kennedy's autobiography is titled True Compass. It is so ironic. And he did stand for things, and he did have a vision. He just couldn't articulate it at the time. So this is why vision is important. What are your most important goals? Let me read you a short sentence or two from my book. When a president has a strong vision, he will be able to convey his policy objectives to the public and to his own staff in a compelling manner. His staff will easily comprehend the president's priorities and channel their energy into the accomplishment of these goals. The president and White House staff will work hard to maintain control of the agenda, resisting the tendency of drift and internal destructive personality conflicts. The president will organize the White House staff in a manner that supports the accomplishment of his vision. So the vision will carry through into the execution, which is my next issue, and it will be strong. Here's an example of non-visionary thinking in a lighthearted manner from a menu I saw in Florida. And the menu said, "Good food takes hours to prepare. You'll have yours in a few minutes." And they delivered on that. So that's called non-visionary thinking. Any more questions or comments about vision until we move to our second? Well, let me just give you, some ideas about vision and the different presidents and how they perform. I believe Jimmy Carter did not have a vision. He was running because he was not Nixon. He ran in the wake of Watergate, where we came close to a constitutional crisis. And Jimmy Carter ran as a good, honest, decent man without a plan, without much of a plan at all. And that carried through into a lack of execution and lack of appreciation of congressional relations and so forth, which we'll come to. Ronald Reagan had a strong vision. He believed in smaller government, and he believed in changing foreign policy. A lot of people miss this about Reagan. He actually wanted to reduce nuclear weapons and make the world safer and tear down the Berlin Wall and so forth. George H.W. Bush was not much of a visionary. He mocked the vision thing, as you may remember. He campaigned on the basis of his managerial acumen, and he had a strong, strong resume. If you went to central casting and said, "Get me a presidential candidate," it would be George H.W. Bush. He had held every major significant position in our government, and yet he lacked a vision. He said, in fact, some people see leadership with trumpets blaring. I see one page turning at a time, and we move in small incremental steps. And yet he did accomplish a lot, which if we have time, we'll talk about. Bill Clinton had a vision, I believe. Bill Clinton wanted to revitalize the Democratic Party, which had been out of power for 12 years. Bill Clinton presented himself as a new Democrat who would not be tied to the orthodoxy of the New Deal and the New Society. He was going to relieve himself of old ideas and get into ideas that are innovative and progressive, and he was going to invigorate the government through reinventing government. George W. Bush started really without a vision. He was the only thing he talked about with vision, he was a compassionate conservative, which was a very different idea of conservatism than is usually presented. But it's like conservatism with a heart. He got his vision clarified with 9/11. Unfortunately, I believe his vision turned into an obsession, and it was too grandiose, too big. In his second inaugural address, he announced the purpose of American foreign policy as ending tyranny in the world. That is a very, very big vision. Barack Obama, domestically, he had a vision of fairness. Fairness. The government exists to ensure fairness among people who don't have health care, among people who are getting screwed by the tax system, among people who have immigration problems. The government is there to protect you. In foreign policy, it was away from the cowboy diplomacy which he perceived of George W. Bush toward engagement with former adversaries and so forth. Donald Trump, the best we can say about a vision is America first. This was his vision, and this was articulated in the inaugural address, and I'll have more to say about that in my next edition. So that's just a brief, very brief summary of each president and how they handled vision. So let me go on now to the second idea, which is how are you going to implement your vision? How are you going to execute your vision? Mario Cuomo liked to say, you can campaign in poetry, but you must govern in prose. These are the details of delivery. Kissinger said, a vision without a plan of execution is nothing but hallucination. And so how are you going to do what you said you're going to do? How will you get there? How are you going to lead the Congress? This is one of your major challenges, working with Congress, a very prideful institution. Do you have a plan? Do you have a congressional liaison who understands how the institution works? Jimmy Carter appointed as his congressional liaison a man who had never been to Capitol Hill, named Frank Moore. And he said, we'll run it being Congress, like we ran the Georgia legislature when Jimmy was governor. Not gonna work, not gonna work. The members of Congress, and remember, Carter had both houses of Congress controlled by the Democrats. He could have gotten a lot done, but he didn't know how to relate to them. He didn't, and I'll give you an excellent example of his lack of what I call leadership acumen. And by the way, I should in fairness say that a much kinder portrayal of Jimmy Carter is found in Stuart Eisenstadt's book on Jimmy Carter. So if you want a balanced view of Jimmy Carter, take a look at Stu Eisenstadt's book. It's a very big book, however. In any case, my image is a little less positive than Stuart's. Of course, Stuart worked for him. Carter went on TV to talk about an energy plan that he had tasked Jim Schlesinger, his energy secretary, with designing. By the way, Schlesinger made the same mistake that Hillary would make with healthcare and that Cheney would make with energy. They shut off the process to any input from members of Congress or the public. It was a gathering of so-called experts. And in the case of Schlesinger, he came up with a bill that had 110 interlocking provisions, taxes on gas guzzlers, incentives for energy efficiency. And Carter was going on television to sell Schlesinger's bill. And he goes on TV in a yellow cardigan sweater. And I say to people, who was he trying to imitate? Everybody says Mr. Rogers. Well, actually, even though that's tempting, it wasn't Mr. Rogers, it was FDR. He was trying to emulate the fireside chats. And he made this very detailed, policy-oriented speech about energy, as he was wont to do. After all, he was an engineer, and he had an engineer's mind, and he was into details. And after the speech, Jimmy Carter's phone rings. Who is it? It's Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House at the time. And he says in his Massachusetts accent, "Mr. Carter, that was a great speech. Now please get on the phone and call every member of every chairman of every committee where your bill is going to go and lobby for your bill." Totally legitimate request. Here's Carter's response, and I quote verbatim, and I'm going to ask you, what's the problem with this response? Quote, "I don't have to call them. They heard the speech." What's the problem with that?
He didn't relate to Congress.
Didn't relate to Congress.
Arrogance.
Arrogance.
Disrespectful.
Disrespectful. Like the professor who says, "Weren't you listening to my lecture?"
Right.
Right?
Passive. No buy-in.
No buy-in. Excellent.
Presumptuous.
What's that?
Presumptuous.
Presumptuous. Excellent.
It's all about people. Persuasion is personal.
Excellent.
One is about relationships.
Outstanding. I love it. One more thing.
Expecting others to do the work.
That's a good one. One more thing.
No opportunity for feedback. You won't
That
put
gets
energy into why they should.
Excellent. Excellent. That's it. There's one more thing. And one of the comments related to it. They didn't hear the same speech.
Right.
The senator from Oklahoma heard a different speech than the senator from California, who heard a different speech than the senator from New Jersey, because we all hear things through our own perspectives, and these states have very different energy profiles. And what's going to work in one state will not work in another. The job of a leader is to go to each senator and to say, how can I make this work for you? How can I make this work for your state? By the way, my bill is probably not perfect. Okay? Here's one of the classic statements about leadership that I hope you will remember. Leadership is not a monologue, it's a dialogue. Jimmy Carter was having a monologue. I said it, now go do it. End of story. And for all the reasons you articulated, it is absolutely off. I could go on with more Jimmy Carter examples, but you'll get the feeling that I'm picking on him, so I'm going to stop. How are you going to lead your own bureaucracy? Does anybody know how big the executive branch of government is?
2 million.
Excellent. Steve, of course, a former Labor Department official. He knows. Depending on how you count, it's between 2 and 3 million. And if you include contractors, it's about 12 million. How are you going to manage 2 million, 3 million, 12 million people? What's your strategy? They are the ones that are going to execute your program. This is the executive branch. Can you even name the agencies? Okay? Do you know who they are? Remember Rick Perry wanted to eliminate 3 but could only name 1, right? Do you know the government you're about to inherit? This is why I have such a disdain for our preference for outsiders and our disdain for insiders. I think it's really dangerous to get people who have no idea of what the government actually is, what it does, and how to influence it. Who will you surround yourself with? Friends or professionals? When Andrew Card left the Bush 43 White House, he said, "I'm so happy I'm leaving because now I can be George's friend again." You see, the president doesn't need a friend as chief of staff. He needs what I call a courageous follower, somebody willing to speak truth to power. I doubt if Rahm Emanuel cared if Obama thought he was a friend or not. He tried to give Obama the advice he thought he needed to hear, like don't try to close Guantanamo, Congress won't let it happen, etc. This is a very important aspect of presidential leadership and any leadership, who you surround yourself with. Because no matter how strong a leader you are, you can't do it alone. You need help. And the president needs a lot of help. And various commissions have told him that over the years. Truman once said, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. Okay? So it's not friendship, it's professionalism. So how did they fare? I talked briefly about Carter. Let me tell you a little bit about Reagan, because it's so interesting what he did and how he was successful in this area of execution. Reagan, as you know, was an outsider. In fact, 5 of the 6 presidents I covered prided themselves on being outsiders. Only one, George H.W. Bush, had no choice, because he was campaigned as an insider and was very proud of it. And by the way, one of his first meetings was with professional managers from the executive branch of government. And he said, I'm one of you. Reagan, who was an ideologue in large measure, but not totally. I believe Reagan had a vision, but not an obsession, as opposed to Bush, who had an obsession, not a vision. Reagan brought with him from California his ideological friends, but he married them to professional politicians in Washington: Jim Baker, David Stockman, Richard Darman, and others. This marriage of ideologues and pragmatists, in the words of David Gergen, was the most successful assembly of political talent in the White House in 50 years. And what did they do? They coached Reagan, who did not know the policies, absolutely no knowledge of policies, but he knew what he believed in, and he knew what he wanted to accomplish, and he knew he needed their help. And my friends, great leaders do not always have to be the smartest person in the room. They defer to expertise when needed, which is a big message for right now, by the way, without me having to tell you that. They sat at Jim, and remember, Reagan wanted to do massive social welfare cuts, massive tax cuts, and defense increases. But the Senate had gone to the Republicans, but the House was still controlled by the Democrats. And Tip O'Neill was still the Speaker of the House. They sat at Jim Baker's table and they wrote out index cards for every meeting Reagan would have with a member of Congress. There would be an index card, and it would say something like this: this congresswoman from Massachusetts really wants to help you, but she's worried about the student loan program. When you meet with her, bring up the student loan program. Now, an arrogant leader would say, I don't need those cards. Clinton would say, I don't need them because I already know that. But Reagan knew it, knew he needed it, and he took the cards. And he met with Democrats face to face. They said, we've seen more of Reagan in 4 months than we saw of Carter in 4 years. And they came away saying, oh my God, he understands us. He knows our issues. He's empathetic. Some of you talked about empathy at the beginning. And they got a lot done with the consent of Democrats to a large measure of what they wanted to do because of this incredible outreach, this incredible lobbying, this incredible dialogue. Again, not a monologue, a dialogue that they were having. And this was, ended up being very successful. So, one more example of the politics with Obama, who really did not have a lot of insider experience. He had served a little less than 2 years in the Senate. And who did he hire? Joe Biden as vice president, who had 36 years of experience in the Senate, and Rahm Emanuel, who they said when he downloaded his Washington contacts, his computer crashed. Okay? He was networked inside. Even though, again, he was basically an outsider, he understood the need to work with insiders in accomplishing your goals and in getting your program through. And Biden ended up being enormously helpful to Obama on the stimulus and on healthcare, both of which were achieved without hardly any Republican support. The stimulus bill got 3 Republican votes, the healthcare 0. But Biden's knowledge of the Senate and ROMs really helped him in this regard. Any questions or comments before we move to our third question? So again, do you have a vision? Do you have a plan of execution? Do you know how to get things done? This is the second thing we should be asking presidential candidates. Gil, is there anything that's come up?
Not yet.
Okay, so we're going to move to our third area, which is structure, management. There's nothing in the Constitution that says this is how the White House must be managed. There's nothing in statute that says this is how the White House must be managed. You have choices. How are you going to organize the White House? Sorry to come back to Carter again, but Carter decided not to have a chief of staff. No chief of staff. Too much like the imperial presidency. Well, how do you think that worked? Not very well, to give an answer. Not very well. In fact, the last year and a half of his presidency, he reluctantly took on a chief of staff. So there's the question, will you have a chief of staff? A very important, very, very important position. There is a very good book by Chris Whipple on the chiefs of staff, which I highly recommend. Most people, most leaders, most managers, what do they say? I have an open door policy, right? Question, when was the last time anyone came through that door? Now, Nixon's White House was incredibly closed. Only 5 people had walk-in access to the Oval Office, which means they could go in without an appointment. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, John Dean, Bryce Harlow, and strangely, Patrick Moynihan. Nixon loved Moynihan's brains. Everybody else, including cabinet secretaries, were headed off by Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and cabinet secretaries, including Mitt Romney's father, Secretary of HUD, could not see the president for as long as a year and a half. That's called a closed operation. And it can't be good for business because you are not getting the information you need. Carter went almost to the other extreme, and he set up this idea of a spokes of the wheel. He had read a book by Stephen Hess on organizing the White House at the Brookings Institution that had a wheel and a spoke, and the radiating spokes. Everybody would have access to the White House, no chief of staff, chaos, a very chaotic organization. And so somewhere in between is probably a good comfort zone to have some degree of closure, but not totally closed to the people you need to see and hear. And here again, we have very different styles among the presidents, and I'm not going to have a chance to get to all of those, but let me pause here and see what questions. By the way, this also pertains to the management of the executive branch, which, as we said, is between 2 and 3 million people. How are you going to manage that branch? How are you going to assure they're aligned with your agenda, if you have one? How are you going to keep monitoring them and what goes on there? These are very important questions that a chief of staff actually can help with. Do we have any comments before we go on to our last element? And then I'm going to leave some.
Yes, there is a question. Is there an example of successful president who didn't work with congressional opposition? What does the president do if opposition refuses to work with him?
That's a very good question. In a sense, Obama, I think, would be an example of somebody who faced very strong and very united Republican opposition. In fact, when Obama was working on the stimulus bill, and he designated Biden as sort of the manager of this bill. And by the way, Biden did a fantastic job managing the stimulus bill. There's a little anecdote where Obama said to Biden, come up with a list of what we need. And Biden wrote down a list and handed it to Obama. And the list said, needs to know the government, needs to be able to work with the cabinet, needs to work with Congress. And Obama looked at the list and he handed it back to Biden and he said, do it. Because he felt Biden was the perfect person for what Biden had written, and he was. But the Republicans, when Obama was driving up to Capitol Hill to negotiate on the stimulus bill, the radio was playing a statement from John Boehner saying, we will not negotiate, we are opposing this bill, lock, stock, and barrel. And so he worked with very strong and very united Republican opposition, and he did pretty well in the first 2 years. Again, I think because of Biden and Emmanuel and others who helped him, not so well in subsequent years. Of course, he lost the 2010 election by a landslide. The Congress was overtaken by Republicans in that year. But he did a pretty good job working with opposition. It's very hard to work if the Congress is opposed to you. It's very hard. Last issue, decision making. A president has to make and announce decisions. This is one of the toughest parts of the job. It's a part of great agony. How will you make and announce decisions? Will you build in diversity? What are the elements of good decision making? Let me ask that as a question. What do you see as the elements of good decision making in the White House or in any place? What are the conditions for good decisions?
You got clarity as a comment.
Okay. Yeah, in the end, you have to be clear when you make a decision.
Consensus.
Consensus.
Timelines. The decisions need to be made in time to be meaningful and effective.
Okay. Okay.
Willing to listen. Ability to see both sides. Listen to all points of view. Decisive. Consider all the variables.
Excellent. I want to focus in on that consider all points of view point. This is so important, and it's so important in the White House. Because, you know, when people, and W said it to Bob Woodward, immediately upon coming into office, he said, Woody, he gave him a nickname, of course, Woody, when people come in here, they're overwhelmed by the Oval. And they say, Mr. President, you're looking good today. And Woody, what I need is for people to come in and say, Mr. President, you're not looking so good today. Unfortunately, he didn't follow his own advice, but it was good advice. The president needs dissenting opinions. Obama was very good at this. Clinton was good at this. Reagan was good at this. W was not good at this. Trump is not good at this. Okay? Let me give you a classic example from John Kennedy, who learned this, I think, better than any president. Kennedy, as you know, inherited the Bay of Pigs idea, which was if we sent in a military expedition to Cuba, or as he called it, Cuba, because the that was lost in Harvard came back in Cuba. If we sent a military force to Cuba, the Cuban people would be so happy to see us that they would overthrow Castro. That was the plan, pretty much. And Kennedy came into the White House and presented it to his staff, and his staff, what do you think they did? You think they said, that's a terrible idea, Mr. President? Which the intelligence community said it was? No, they said, great idea, great idea. Everybody, yes, 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 of course, do it, do it. And he did it. And as you know, it was a disaster. Here's the leadership moment for John Kennedy. He went on national television after the Bay of Pigs, and he made the following statement, and I challenge you to come up with a similar statement in our lifetime from a politician. Ladies and gentlemen, success has 1,000 fathers, and failure is an orphan. I failed, blame me. What happened to his popularity after that statement? It shot way up. Why? Because people want from their leaders honesty. They don't want perfection, they want honesty. In an international survey of what followers look for leaders all over the world, Barry Posner and Jim Kouzes found 4 things that followers look for in their leaders: honesty, forward-looking, inspirational, and competent. Honesty, forward-looking, inspirational, and competent are the 4 things followers throughout the world, by race, by gender, by religion, look for in their leaders. And Kennedy was being honest in a way that very few, if any, politicians have been honest. And how will you handle conflict? You can't get rid of conflict. It's going to be part of your administration, and how you handle it, how you absorb it, how you respond to it. Obama, as a mediator, had a phenomenal ability to hear diverse points of view and to meld them into something workable. In fact, it was said when he managed the Harvard Law Review that they've never seen anybody able to take right and left and meld it into something workable. Remarkable ability, which he also did in his administration. So these are my 4 elements. These are the 4 questions you should be asking candidates. Do you have a vision? Do you have a plan of execution? Do you know how to manage? Do you have a plan of management? And do you know how to make good and sound decisions? And I leave you with these in the most, have you ever heard this? The most important election of our lifetime. We hear it every single election, don't we? This time it may really be true. As you go into the voting booth, think about these things and other things. And let me now see if we have a few remaining minutes for questions.
Well, while the questions are getting written up, I just first of all want to thank you. We're going to thank you again at the end. This is incredibly fascinating, and I want to ask a question that I think is on a lot of our minds. You just said something very thought-provoking and maybe provocative in this moment in history, which is leaders all over the world get what they have in common is that their followers trust their honesty. So what happened here in America? What's going on?
Yeah, this is a great question, and you know, it's a very hard question to answer definitively. I could speculate, but I do think the lack of honesty is wearing thin. It's one thing to be dishonest about an economic program or even a tax policy, although I have concerns about that, but it's very hard to be dishonest when people are dying. I think this is kind of a fact on the ground that catches up with leaders that you can't talk your way out of. Stephen Covey once said, you can't talk your way out of problems that you behaved your way into. You can't talk your way out of problems that you behaved your way into. And I think there's a lot of truth in that.
Beautiful. Here's a question. Clinton's vision, regarding Clinton's vision, first term was NAFTA, second term getting China into the WTO, but these were Republican priorities. What gives?
So Clinton was a centrist politician. He didn't operate out of absolutes. He was a pragmatist. He was a new Democrat. And yes, he took on Republican issues, like, for example, welfare reform. He took that on after the Monica Lewinsky disaster. He was coached by Dick Morris, who went into the White House under a surname. He was so despised. But he told Clinton, if you want any chance of winning in 96, you better move back to the center. And Clinton listened to him, and he did. Clinton was a very astute politician, and he understood the meaning of 94 when the Republicans under Newt Gingrich took over the House and totally devastated the Democrats. Clinton understood that was largely in part because of the failed healthcare bill and other things that were pulling him to the left. And so he did go back to the center, and he did not mind taking on Republican ideas. By the way, Obama's healthcare bill was built in part on Mitt Romney's Massachusetts healthcare bill. So centrist Democrats don't mind taking on ideas and even policies from Republicans. And I think that's healthy, actually. I think that's healthy for our democracy.
Another question. What about not just do you know how to manage, but how to manage in a government environment, not private industry? In my opinion, private industry experience is not particularly translatable to government.
I agree.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And it's absolutely true. Mm-hmm. And it's one thing, though, to have operated, let's say, a large corporation like Rex Tillerson, for example, who was an executive in the sense of the word that he managed a very large organization. It's another thing like Trump to have managed a family business, which has no real oversight and so forth, nothing that would approximate Congress, for example. So yeah, I think, yes, it's different, and it's different within the difference. In other words, there's a difference between a large corporation and a smaller mom and pop, if you will, or smaller organization. But still, the private sector is different. The constraints are fewer. There are not the constitutional concerns every day on your agenda. So yes, I agree. Which is why, again, I think we sometimes underappreciate the importance of government experience, even on the state level as a governor, which is an executive position. And many of our presidents, of course, have been governors.
Do you think that President Trump takes serious advice from anyone in the White House?
No.
There you go.
No. I've read Woodward's book called Fear. I've read the Stable Genius book. All of the accounts indicate that he doesn't. And those who have tried to give him advice are gone. Jim Mattis being perhaps the most prominent example that we can think of. Either he really believes he's a genius, or he believes he knows better. I mean, a man that says, I know more than the generals, and now he's saying, I know more than the scientists. This is not a man who takes advice. And that's a huge problem, huge.
Indeed, indeed. Another question. Putting the trauma of the assassination aside and considering the brevity of his term, why is JFK on the top 10 list?
That's a great question. And I looked at the criteria again, and I can't fill in all the blanks with him. I will say this about Kennedy, that I had a great faith. Kennedy had an amazing ability to learn from his mistakes. He had an unusual ability to learn from his mistakes. And every president's going to learn from mistakes. And the first thing you have to do is admit them. And the second thing you have to do is learn from them. And he had an amazing capacity to do that. Plus, he was very involved in humanitarian concerns. He started the Peace Corps. There were many. He did try to push civil rights, although he really couldn't get it through until Johnson came in. He changed the composition of the House Rules Committee, actually, which was bottling up the civil rights legislation. He lobbied for the expansion of that committee to 15 members, the House Rules Committee, which was blocking the civil rights laws. And the civil rights laws started to go through because the House Rules Committee was now issuing rules for them to go to the floor. So he did a lot, and he did manage the Cuban Missile Crisis very differently from the way he managed the Bay of Pigs. He built in diversity. He left the room when they were debating. He went to make a political speech in Chicago when they were debating the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he told people, disagree with your boss, disagree with me. I don't want yes people in here. We're in an international crisis. And so again, he had the ability to learn from his mistakes. I think he would have gone on to be a pretty darn good president.
Okay, and we're going to close with, I'm going to combine two questions into one here, even though they're different. They're both about Biden. One question is educated guess on the VP pick and who would be the wisest choice in your opinion. And how does Biden escape the taint of his role in enactment of the crime bill? Those are two doozy questions, but we're gonna close up with those.
Right. So the crime bill is 1994. I believe it was a very different environment. I don't actually know all the details behind Biden's vote on that bill. I do know it's seen now as a very severe bill for minorities, for African Americans and others. The only thing I can say is that I believe Biden has changed. I think he's changed his views. And by the way, I wanted to point out an article in the Washington Post that says Biden now envisions an FDR-like presidency. Talk about vision, and Biden's really talking about pretty lofty goals, pretty ambitious agenda. In terms of the pick for vice president, I personally really like Val Kilmer. I can't Kellums, I guess, the former police chief. I think she's terrific. I don't know who he'll pick. I have no idea. I'm not a huge fan of Kamala Harris, but he may go that way. But I would pick, if I were him, the former police commissioner.
Okay, Michael, you know, this has been absolutely rivetingly fascinating and so informative. You know, there's a teaching in the Torah about if you should decide, Israelites, someday to choose a king, you can do that, but you have to remember that that king has to have a scroll of the Torah next to him on his throne at all times. And that Torah, of course, is the repository of wisdom and insight. And I would say that these 4 questions you taught us today, that is Torah. And I really hope that, God willing, our next president will have that Torah and that insight that you have taught us all today. Thank you so much for your brilliant exploration and insight giving that you've given to us all today. It is an incredible gift. Kol hakavod. Thank you very much, everybody,
Thank you very much. Very kind.
Today.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Okay.
Have a great day.